Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. How the mighty have fallen. 8 days after launching Luna 25, Roscosmos experiences a cataclysmic error with the spacecraft, and the lander smashes into the moon and the rest of the Russian space program with it. And meanwhile, in the world of space tourism, in the world of things that we would love to see happen, would you pay $30,000 if you could go on a vacation to the moon? Would you save for years? Would you take money out of your retirement account? Would you do anything possible in order to save that $30,000 so you could go on a vacation to our natural satellite, perhaps visit the landing site of Apollo 11 or an equally important historic landmark on the moon? Well, of course, most of us would. But is this really within the realm of possibility? Well, we're going to check out some information that was provided by Andy Weir, yes, the author of The Martian a few years ago, and how the scenario that he paints in that particular article seems a lot more possible now that Starship is about to enter service. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon. Once again, welcome to The Angry Astronaut. As you can see here, most of the stuff in my studio is disappearing, together with about 2/3 of my possessions yesterday at a pretty big sale that I held. But nevertheless, not everything sold, and I'm hoping I can clear everything out of this place in the coming few days so I can leave by next Sunday. Hopefully, we'll see how things go. In the meantime, I have a special offer for all Patreon members or anybody who wants to be a Patreon member. This is only good for the next 24 hours. Today, of course, is the 20th, so we're talking through midnight on the 21st, and that's Greenwich Mean Time or GMT. Any $5 Patreon member, anybody who signs up for Patreon for the $5 amount, will receive a digital copy of my book. If you're already a Patreon member, make a $5 contribution through my GoFundMe page, and then send me an email just letting me know what your Patreon ID is, and you'll get a free digital copy of my book as well. So we're talking 50% off of my usual price for my book if you join up with Patreon. And of course, you can get that 50% off if you just join Patreon and then immediately deactivate your membership afterwards. If you want to do that, I certainly am totally fine with it. However, you also get a free membership to my Discord server with lots of benefits that come with that, including early releases, exclusive content, and an opportunity to talk to a lot of really interesting people who are heavily engaged in the space industry. Okay, enough self-promotion. Let's get on to the topic at hand. First of all, in a devastating moment for Roscosmos, it has become painfully clear that the Russian space program is not what it used to be. The last lunar probe that the Russians sent to the surface of the moon landed in the early 1970s. Indeed, the Russians were the first to conduct a soft landing on the surface of the moon in 1967. And over the course of nearly 60 years since then, obviously, the Russian space program has been in a precipitous state of decline. 9 days ago, spaceflight enthusiasts around the world held their breath as Russia finally sent a new probe back to the moon. It has been such a long time since Russia has attempted anything this ambitious, but it used to be something so routine for them. the Russian Space Agency, or the Soviet Space Agency as it was back in the old days, conducted a successful lunar flyby 10 years before Apollo set down on the surface. This is the first image of the so-called dark side of the moon that humans ever saw, and it was returned to us on January the 2nd, 1959 by Luna 1. The Soviets then conducted a series of lunar flybys and also landing attempts on the moon, experiencing one disappointing failure after another until Luna 9 conducted the first successful soft landing on the moon in 1966. January the 31st, 1966 is when the probe was actually launched, and it landed on the 3rd of February 1966, not 1967 as I said during the introduction. And this, by the way, is the first image that was ever returned to us from the surface of the moon. For a long period of time, the Soviets seemed to have an insurmountable lead in space, a lead that was almost certainly going to put them on the lunar surface before Americans could go there. However, the death of the head of the Soviet space program, a driven genius by the name of Sergei Korolev, well, after he was gone, the Soviet space program lost a lot of its momentum. He was the man who secured a lot of the funding for the program, and also a man whose direction provided a great deal of the inspiration and also the extremely good planning that led to a lot of the early Soviet successes. Without his leadership, the Soviet program to get to the moon before the United States was doomed. And things just kept going downhill from there, although that was not immediately apparent. As the United States was winding down their Apollo program, the Russians were continuing to carry out ambitious missions to the moon. Luna 19 orbited the moon in 1971. Luna 20 managed to conduct a lunar sample return to Earth on February 25th, 1972. Then you had Luna 21, which deployed the Lunokhod 2 rover on the surface of the moon in January of 1973. And then you had Luna 22 in June of 1974. This is after we started giving up on the moon. This orbited the moon once again. And then Luna 23, which was a lunar lander that landed in Mare Crisium in 1974, October that is of 1974. And then finally Luna 24, which was launched on August 14th, 1976, and it too was a lunar sample return mission that successfully delivered lunar regolith back to the Soviets about 2 weeks later. Amazing accomplishments being carried out by the Soviet space program on the surface of the moon long after the United States had decided to give up on the whole damn thing. And by the way, the film you're watching right now is a documentary from the Soviet space program about the Luna 21 mission and the Lunokhod 2 rover. However, after 1976, the Soviets also gave up on the moon and haven't launched a lander since. Well, that is until Luna 25, and it was a less ambitious mission by far than the Luna 24 mission. No rovers involved, no sample return, just an attempt to put a lander on the surface of the moon at the South Pole before anybody else could. Indeed, if Luna 25 had managed to carry out its mission successfully, it probably would have beaten the Chandrayaan lander from India to the South Pole and achieved another historic first for the Russian space program. But instead, the Russians lost contact of the Luna 25. The Russians were unable to put the spacecraft into a landing orbit, and it smashed into the lunar surface. This is, of course, going to create lots of repercussions, not only at Roscosmos, but throughout the Russian government. Although every space program suffers setbacks from time to time, this was a critical moment for the future of Roscosmos. The Luna 26 mission is a lunar orbiter, not a lunar lander, which means Russia has no plans in the foreseeable future to try again. Obviously, Vladimir Putin is going to make some heads roll, but it is Vladimir Putin's head that should really be rolling here. all of the enormous amounts of money that he's had to invest in this ill-conceived invasion of Ukraine has led to underfunding at Roscosmos, to them losing some of their launch facilities at Kazakhstan because they can't pay for their lease, let alone all of the other setbacks that the organization has suffered simply because Russia can no longer afford it. Although the fall of the Soviet Union was undoubtedly the biggest blow to the Russian space program, the advent of Vladimir Putin was probably the second biggest blow. So now I'm going to move on to the next topic with a question. Are you a pedantic little shit? Do you ask questions like, why does the Federation have starships if they can beam people hundreds of light years? Or why don't the Galactic Empire and the Rebel Alliance just mass-produce droids with piloting skills instead of risking their own lives? Well, good, so am I. That actually isn't my question. That's Andy Weir's question at the beginning of an article that he wrote at the end of his book called Artemis, interestingly enough, entitled The Economics of Artemis. It is a fascinating article, and with the advent of Starship, the ideas that he puts forward in it have become a lot more feasible. Now, the most obvious problem that we face in terms of getting people into space, let alone all the way to the moon, is the colossal cost per kilogram that we currently have even with reusable rockets like Falcon 9. In order to achieve a low enough price point per kilogram, in order to make a mission to the moon affordable for the average person, first of all, you need to have a 100% reusable spacecraft. There's no way around it. If you expend even a small portion of a spacecraft on every mission, you're going to lose so much money that the cost per kilogram is going to skyrocket. So if we're going to imagine an affordable price for a tourist ticket all the way to the moon, an important assumption needs to be made here. And this is what Andy Weir says, quote, "The commercial space industry, through competition and engineering advances, will settle down to the same fuel to overhead ratio as the modern airline industry." Mr. Weir then goes on to crunch some numbers and discovers that on average, airlines spend 16.5% of their costs on fuel. So what we need to do in order to determine an affordable ticket to the moon, we need to take that same 16.5% and apply it to the cost of rocket fuel to determine how much a mission needs to cost in order to make a ticket about as affordable. Believe me, that's a tall order, but with the advent of Starship, it is theoretically possible. Now, first of all, let's talk about Starship's theoretical payload capabilities. 150 metric tons is about the maximum that we're talking about Starship being capable of lofting into low Earth orbit, assuming we can manage 100% reusability on the spacecraft. 150 metric tons is 150,000 kilograms. Now, what you're looking to do, given the fact that this is going to be a relatively short mission, is you're not going to have a mere 100 passengers on board. Instead, what you're looking to do is to cram as many passengers on board as you possibly can, along with their luggage. Now, if we reserve 100 kilograms for the passengers' bodies, another 100 kilograms for not only the luggage, but also the life support systems and everything that's necessary to keep these passengers alive for a few days in order to get them not only to low Earth orbit, but all the way to the moon. Well, for 110 metric tons, you could cram 550 passengers into the fairing of Starship. Now, yeah, that's a lot of passengers being crushed into a relatively small area, but it's no more compacted than passengers are on a Boeing 777. Now, of course, we're also looking at a longer journey than people on an airliner have to take, but let's assume that we have a space station in orbit where they could stop off, relax, stretch their legs before they took the second leg all the way to the moon. Let us further assume that you need 40 metric tons for the crew and for the necessary instrumentation, pilots, etc., in order to make sure that the whole thing is safe and well manned and that the passengers can be well taken care of. Again, keep in mind, you've got 550 passengers, so you need a pretty substantial crew as well. So you have to add, as I say, another 40 metric tons for that, and then 100 metric tons for Starship itself. 250 250 metric tons total for the entire spacecraft. It requires 12.04 kilograms of rocket fuel for every kilogram that we want to put into low Earth orbit. Now, this is according to NASA, based on hydrolox fuel being used, not methalox. Methalox may be a more powerful fuel source. It has a shorter ISP, but it probably can deliver a lot more performance per ton of fuel. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and stick with hydrolox in order to make sure that we are erring on the side of caution. So if you take the mass of Starship at 250,000 kilograms times 12.04, you come up with 3,010,000 kilograms of fuel. Now, how much does fuel cost? Well, back in 2014, NASA was paying approximately 24.5 cents per kilogram. So if you take the total amount of fuel times that cost per kilogram, you come up with a total cost of $737,450 worth of fuel in order to get all of this mass plus Starship into orbit. Now, before I go any further, a lot of you are saying, now, wait a minute, damn it. I know that Starship carries a whole lot more fuel than that in both Super Heavy and in the orbiter combined. Well, the reason for that is you need to keep a lot of fuel in reserve in both Super Heavy and in Starship in order to be able to land both vehicles. Now, if you have a fuel depot in orbit, that means that you will be able to provide Starship at least with all of the fuel that it needs in order to come back down and land, which means you can run the ship almost completely dry, getting it to low Earth orbit, reducing the total amount of fuel required for the entire spacecraft. Now, the fuel required to land Super Heavy, that's a lot more complicated, but nevertheless, you can see why there's such a substantial difference between what Starship can do when you're reusing the spacecraft versus what Starship can do when you're not reusing it. 250 tons, or perhaps even more than that if you're expending the ship, versus 150 tons if you need to keep fuel in reserve in order to save the spacecraft. But that is absolutely what you need to do in order to keep this process affordable. And so let's move on to the total cost of launching Starship. Once again, if everything's reusable and all you're really paying for is the fuel plus the overhead cost, at 16.5% for just the fuel, it means that the entire flight should cost 6.06 times as much as the fuel costs, which means that the total cost for the flight is $4,468,947. Now let's divide that figure by 550 passengers, and I think you're about to get pretty excited here. The cost per passenger to get to low Earth orbit is $8,125 per person. Just over $8,000 to go to orbit. And once again, this is a price point that's more than double that of what Elon was estimating at the beginning of the Starship program when he was trying to get people excited about it. So assuming that he's off by a factor of 2 here, you're still looking at a ridiculously affordable cost to get to orbit. But what about getting to the moon? Well, the delta V requirements of getting from low Earth orbit to the lunar surface is approximately 5.93 kilometers per second, substantially less than it costs to get from the surface of the Earth out to low Earth orbit. Kind of strange to think that it requires so much less to get all the way out to a destination 250,000 miles away as opposed to just a few hundred miles up from the surface of the Earth. But that's the kind of gravity that we have to overcome. And in order to deliver this kind of delta V, you need to have another 3.73 kilograms worth of fuel for every kilogram you want to put on the moon, which means you need to pay for 3.73 kilograms worth of fuel to be delivered to orbit in order to deliver every kilogram to the lunar surface. Now, the cost of doing this will drop off tremendously when we start delivering that fuel from the moon and manufacturing it there, as opposed to having to truck it all the way up from Earth. But let's assume that we are actually having to take it up from Earth, at least at the moment. Well, that means that the total flight, including the flight to low Earth orbit, is going to be 4.73 times as expensive as the cost of just getting to low Earth orbit, or $38,431. $38,431 for a one-way ticket to the moon. And the cost of coming back is going to be substantially less because although in theory the Delta V is all the same coming back, you are getting rid of the vast majority of the Delta V through aerobraking. You have to use much less rocket fuel in order to go from the moon all the way back to the Earth, use the atmosphere to bleed off the vast majority of your speed, and make your landing. That being the case, then let's be really conservative and say that it's going to cost half as much to go back. But what about the cost of staying on the moon? Wouldn't that be ridiculously expensive? Well, not really if we're assuming that you can get this much mass out to the moon for such a low price. And the overhead cost for cargo, at least in the airline industry, is much, much less than the overhead cost for transporting passengers, about half the cost. That being the case, then, lunar freight can be delivered for about $166 per kilogram, which means that assuming you're eating 500 to 1,000 grams of food per day and all of that is imported from Earth because you're a spoiled mother, well, that means that the cost of your food is going to be anywhere from $80 to $160 per day. And then it would drop off considerably if you decided to eat in situ grown food, and that could be a wide variety of things, at least as far as fruits and vegetables are concerned in hydroponics. But again, let's assume that you're going it very expensive up there and you're going to be spending $80 to $160 per day and $500 a day for the hotel, because once the hotel is built, once again, a lot more affordably because you can deliver freight to the moon so much more affordably. Let's call it $800 a day to stay at the hotel. And if you stay there for 2 weeks, that means you're looking at another $11,200, bringing the total cost of your expedition to a little north of $70,000. But once again, we are assuming that all of those extra fuel costs have to be applied because we're bringing the fuel from Earth. If the fuel is being manufactured on the moon and delivered to low Earth orbit, that's going to reduce the cost of delivering that fuel by at least 50% and probably a lot more than that, which means the total cost of the trip might drop down to $40,000 or even around $35,000 round trip, all expenses paid. And who wouldn't pay that if they could find some way of affording it? And incidentally, the numbers that I presented here are not exactly the same numbers that Mr. Weir presents in his article. I've made some modifications based on Starship's mass, based on Starship's fuel consumption, that sort of thing, in order to bring it a little bit more up to date. It is, however, a little bit more expensive than Andy Weir was estimating back in 2016, but once again, he freely admits that he was basing all of his calculations on the bullshit assumption that the fuel to overhead ratio of spaceflight is going to be ultimately the same as the fuel to overhead ratio on commercial airline flights. However, if you achieve 100% reusability, this becomes extremely feasible, and not just for Starship. Not only do the Europeans have ambitions of making the Ariane 6 a reusable rocket in the future, but they also have a reusable second stage called the Suzy that's also scheduled to go into service in the early 2030s. Now, once again, this is Arianespace we're talking about here, so who knows how long it's going to take for all of this to come to fruition, but my point is everybody is working on reusability right now. 100% reusability because it delivers the kind of cost we've been discussing in this video. And in my book, I actually talk about alternative missions that would involve the Suzy and also the Sierra Space Dream Chaser if you mounted it on top of a 100% reusable Rocket Lab Neutron rocket that's capable of delivering, at least in theory, 13 metric tons to low Earth orbit, which is the combined mass of the Dream Chaser plus the Shooting Star module plus the 5.5 metric tons worth of cargo that it can carry. Interestingly enough, if you crunch the numbers, Assuming the same fuel to overhead ratio expense-wise, the prices get super affordable for lots of different launch providers, not just SpaceX. It's extremely exciting. I am, of course, grateful to SpaceX for spearheading this concept and for Elon Musk for talking about a $2 million per launch price point, which honestly I don't think is ever going to be achievable for a massive rocket like Starship. But the point is, it doesn't have to get down to that. It can get double that price and still deliver a ridiculously reasonable cost for getting human beings not only to orbit, but all the way to the moon. Smash that like, hit that subscribe. Also, please check the description for ways to attend my upcoming tour and also to reserve a digital copy of my book. And until Andy Weir's dreams and those of others become a reality, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.